and he is currently Senior Project Manager for the Cultural Resource Management Program of the Gila River Indian Community, where he's done a great deal of research. He's also worked in other parts of the southern Southwest, so for example, in New Mexico, and before that, done extensive research in the Great Plains, such as Montana and North Dakota. He's produced many CRM reports. And in addition, he's published in major journals, for example, American Antiquity, Journal of Archaeological Science, Human Ecology, and Arkansas's very own Kiva. Tonight's talk is going to be based on some recent research and interesting results he's gotten on work in the Gila River community and Eastern Pueblo immigrants on the middle Gila River. So without further ado, let's get Chris to tell us about what he's found.
Thank you for that rousing introduction. See if I can get this to work here. I believe that should be up. On this, as so often is the case, this presentation has evolved a little bit since I did the abstract. And we've gotten, for one thing, a couple of radiocarbon dates that changed our perspective on this a little bit. So I'm going to show you that here tonight. Recent data recovery investigations that were completed by the Gila River Indian Community Cultural Resource Management Program in the Blackwater area along the Middle Gila River found evidence for previously undocumented migration of people from the Eastern Pueblo region of the Southwest. The work was undertaken for a proposed sand and gravel facility on the south bank of the Gila River in Political District 1 of the community. A single archaeological site located here was identified within the project area, which is located less than 2 kilometers, almost directly north of Casa Grande National Monument. GR 1425 ceramic and lithic data suggests that Eastern Pueblo migrants visited the site, possibly around the time of the Pueblo Revolt in AD 1680. Extensive evidence for weapon manufacturing suggests that the temporary relocation occurred because of conflict, and the timing and exceptionally long distance the migrants traveled suggests they were trying to escape Spanish colonists. The Middle Gila River encompasses a 120-mile segment of the river that begins east of Florence and continues downstream to the confluence of the Gila and Salt Rivers in the Phoenix Basin of Arizona. This stretch of the river has thousands of hectares of land that are ideal for irrigation agriculture. Blackwater has also been an important settlement location along this stretch of the river because during times of low flow, when surface water was unavailable in most of the river bed, this was one of the few locations where the water reefed or came to the surface of the river because of bedrock outcrops. The area is named for a small but deep body of water that was called Blackwater Lake. The quote unquote lake, it was really more of a slough, was fed by springs, and it was referred to as black because it was said to be so deep that it was impossible to see to the bottom. When Euro-Americans first visited the region, the Akbalatam were still living in the Blackwater area. Importantly, they're one of the few Native American groups who were never forced to relocate as a result of colonial expansion, and major changes in their cultural traditions did not occur until the late 1800s. Despite repeated attempts by missionaries, it was not until this time that any of the Akbalatam converted to Christianity. As a result of this independence from Euro-Americans, the Middle Gila served as a refuge for people fleeing Spanish colonialism throughout much of the historic period. GR 1425 occurs an important environmental, cultural, and economic crossroads. This location has long been a liminal space, and it remains so today. The site occurs at the very edge of the modern political boundary between the Grick and the surrounding Euro-American community. And although this division is comparatively recent, evidence suggests that this location has been a similar social boundary between upstream and downstream communities along the Middle Gila for a considerable time. The site is directly north of Casa Grande National Monument, which is located near the tail end of the Gru Casa Grande Canal system, and the site is also at the head gate of the Blackwater Canal system. Thus, GR 1425 lies at the interface of upstream and downstream canal systems along the Middle Gila River. Perhaps not surprisingly then, in many ways, the cultural remains at the site are atypical for the Middle Gila River, and the collection is unique in multiple respects, including unprecedented ceramics and lithics type that suggest migrants from the Eastern Pueblo region temporarily stayed at the site. When it was initially recorded, GR 14 was defined based on the distribution of surface artifacts. Because the site is located near the head gate of the Blackwater Canal system, many of the cultural features of the site are associated with 8 canals that pass through it and extend to the west. In general, cultural remains are most concentrated along the berms of these canals. As a result, the site has an elongated linear nature, and it bifurcates along 2 different canal branches. Pottery recovered from GR 1425 show that people were undertaking activities at the site by at least the colonial period around AD 700, but the focus here is on the remains that appear to have been behind by Eastern Pueblo migrants. Despite extensive subsurface investigations, no pit houses or any other permanent habitation features were identified, and structures at this site were more ephemeral constructions that were built in derelict canal channels. The majority of the artifacts that were recovered, including all the Eastern Pueblo remains, were collected from the mountain ground surface in locus A, which is here, locus B, which is here, and then locus C, which is in this part of the site. Most of the subsurface features other than canals also occurred in these 3 loci. 2 radiocarbon dates were obtained for maize kernels found on the floor of feature 44, which is this unusually long and narrow ephemeral structure, which was built in an abandoned classic period canal in locus B. This suggests the feature had to have been after the classic period, and historic period artifacts from the early 1900s were found in the roof wall above the floor, which also suggests the feature must be comparatively recent. Because both the radiocarbon dates are statistically identical and they are derived for short-lived materials from the same context, a weight average error, age error calculation and calibration was performed. This results in an age of 122 plus or minus 13 BP, which calibrates to 2 possible ranges at the 95% confidence level. The first is from 1806 to 1925 Cal AD, and the second is from 1687 to 1730 Cal AD. When multiple ranges are present, as is the case here, it is necessary to use other lines of evidence to decide which probability range is most correct. The following discussion presents data that indicate that 1687 to 1730 Cal AD intercept is the most likely date for feature 44. In total, 3,462 indigenous ceramic sherds were recovered from GR 1425. Despite the relatively small size of the indigenous collection, the ceramics are surprisingly diverse, both temporally and geographically. No complete or reconstructible vessels were recovered, which is consistent with the lack of permanent habitation at the site. The vast majority of the ceramics were produced locally, i.e. that is within the Phoenix Basin, with non-local sherds just comprising 0.4%. However, our focus is on the presence of pottery produced in the Rio Grande region of New Mexico, which is surprising because these wares rarely occur in Arizona, with only a handful of such sherds having been identified in the San Pedro Valley in southeastern Arizona. Both Rio Grande glazeware and Rio Grande utility wares were identified at GR 1425. Rio Grande glazeware was produced in modern day New Mexico from the late prehistoric through the historic period from roughly 1300 to 1700. The production region is broad, but is primarily the Rio Grande Valley, bounded by Pecos on the north and Las Cruces to the south. Fired in an oxygen-rich atmosphere, The lead-based recipes yielded a glaze paint ranging in color from deep black to faintly purple to root beer brown to bright grass green. These glaze paints were sometimes combined with white or red matte pigments to create designs on top of a variety of slip colors. Red design elements were more common than white and were more often outlined in glaze paint. The wear is often divided into 3 temporal phases based on rim form. Early, from AD 1313 to 1500 or later. Intermediate, from AD 1410 to 1600 or more. And late, from AD 1480 to in around 1700. Additionally, multiple types within each rim form are defined based on design and temper, but San Clemente polychrome is the only type identified in this project. This variety is characterized by interior and exterior bowl surfaces slipped in different colors, although the interior surface is occasionally slipped in 2 colors. This type was typically produced in the region between Albuquerque and Las Cruces. The temper used in the sherds allows for a narrowing of production provenience to one of 2 broad Rio Grande districts, which are the Central Rio Grande or the Northern Rio Abajo. However, both are Southern Tiwa. The data recovery investigation resulted in the recovery of 1,923 lithics. The collection from GR 1425, like the ceramics, is unusual in multiple respects, and although relatively small, a surprisingly diverse range of raw material and artifact types are present. The collection also has an unusually high incidence of fine-grained raw materials, which within the Phoenix Basin are closely associated with the production of flake stone projectile points. Furthermore, 11 of the 22 points from the site were classified as preforms, which is a substantially higher incidence than is found elsewhere along the Middle Gila, where preforms generally do not exceed about 10% of collections. The comparatively high incidence of unfinished points is consistent with the large amount of point production debris that was recovered from GR 1425, and so further supports the observation that the projectile point production was one of the primary activities that resulted in the deposition of lithics at the site. 7 finished projectile points in the site collection date to the historic period, and the atypically small size of 2 other points suggests they also are from the historic period. Consequently, all of the points may be associated with the migrants. The lithic data clearly show that arrow point production was one of the most common activities that was conducted at the site that produced lithic debris. This is surprising and atypical for the Phoenix Basin because stone points were used for hunting large game or warfare, and the site is not in a suitable habitat for hunting large animals. This suggests that the majority of the lithic collection was produced at a time when intense conflict was occurring. This figure shows the proportion of flake types for the 2 most common materials in the collection. Given the range of production products that are present, as well as the presence of cores of both material types, it is present that on-site reduction of both materials must have occurred. However, these 2 materials were clearly reduced using different strategies. Although they have roughly similar proportions of primary flakes and shatter, a substantially higher percentage of tertiary flakes, especially complex ones, are present in the chert collection. Complex flakes have more than 3 scars on their dorsal surface, and they are most likely to have been produced during the late stages of biface reduction, as in producing projectile points. The difference in reduction strategy for the 2 raw materials is also readily apparent in the proportions of secondary flakes that have cortex on their platforms. A bifacial reduction strategy that employs flake blanks to make points will result in a low incidence of reduction products that have platforms with cortex, because the edge of the biface that forms the removed flake platform will lack cortex on at least one surface for certain. In contrast, when reducing whole nodules produce expedient flake tools, The exterior of the nodule forms the flake platform and therefore is likely to have cortex present. The difference in reduction strategy between the fine and coarse grain materials is also readily apparent in the size of the reduction products. While nearly half of the chert flakes are the smallest size grade, basalt flakes are most commonly the largest size grade. The production of arrow points involves the removal of comparatively small flakes, and the removed flake size generally decreases during the late stage of reduction of the point. In contrast, efficient flake tools must be sufficiently large to be handheld. Consequently, reduction strategies that involve the removal of large flakes will result in more efficient tool production. The GR 1425 lithic collection also has an unusually high proportion of atypical materials that appear to be associated with the migrants. These include a variety of different types of exotic cherts and chalcedonies. The exotic nature of the raw materials is most evident among the obsidian types. And in contrast to the other lithic materials, it is possible to assign comparatively precise source locations for obsidian using XRF analysis. Not only is obsidian comparatively abundant in the collection, multiple types of obsidian that are uncommon within the Phoenix Basin are present. This figure shows some of the most common sources from sites within the region, including 4 of the compounds at Casa Grande National Monument and the Gru site, which is also almost due south of GR 1425. While most of the site collections generally include a variety of obsidian types, usually a single type is substantially more common than other varieties, which you can see for each of the different site collections. Multiple lines of evidence suggest that obsidian was primarily obtained through trade, and the tendency for people to interact with the same partners probably accounts for this pattern. This is especially the case for single component sites such as Gru, where over 95% of the obsidian was from the superior source. In contrast, the collection from GR 1425 is dispersed evenly among obsidian types, and 3 sources count individually for approximately 25% each. In any case, the diverse yet comparatively equitable distribution of obsidian frequents at GR 1425 is unusual and inconsistent with collections from elsewhere. The GR 1425 collection also has the highest incidence of Cow Canyon obsidian that has ever been identified within the Phoenix Basin. This obsidian is located in eastern Arizona, and it generally occurs in low frequencies outside the source area. For example, Cow Canyon comprised just 2% of the obsidian from the prehistoric site of Snaketown, but its presence does indicate some level of interaction between the source region and the people on the Middle Gila communities during prehistory. Use of government mountain obsidian from north central Arizona generally declined over time in the study area, and it was rarely employed by the late historic period. The comparatively high incidence of this material within the 1425 collection is therefore more consistent with an early historic period collection. These data also clearly show that the incidence of Sauceda obsidian, which is located to the south in the territory of the closely allied Tohono O'odham, generally increased through time, such that by the late historic period, it was the predominant source that was utilized within the Phoenix Basin. Sauceda obsidian is also more common than Government Mountain for all of the comparative collections, but these 2 types are equally abundant as GR 1425. It is probable that the migrants traded with local residents in order to obtain this obsidian, which may account for the nearly equal abundance of these 2 sources. Finally, the GR 1425 collection also includes the only piece of Jemez obsidian from the northern Rio Grande Valley that has ever been identified within the Phoenix Basin. The other sites in the Blackwater area include assemblages from the pre-classic through the post-classic periods, after which no new known permanent habitation of the project area occurred until the late 1800s. Despite the fact that these collections represent the entire known late prehistoric temporal sequence for the project area, the GR 1425 collections differs from all of them. This supports the suggestion that it was left behind by recent migrants who brought some materials with them, and it postdates the other comparative collections. The Cow Canyon source is located south of the Zuni Pueblos to the northeast, but the migrants may have acquired this obsidian while traveling to the Middle Gila. Consequently, the most parsimonious explanation is that the migrants came to the Central Rio Grande and or Rio Bajo districts, and where the glaze wares were made. The presence of utilitarian ceramics and Jemez obsidian from this general region also supports this possibility. In order to reach the Middle Gila, the immigrants from the Rio Grande region would have had to pass through eastern Arizona, where Cow Canyon obsidian is located. Consequently, as they pass through, they may have acquired this obsidian. And I don't know if you can read this, but Google Maps says it's a 152-hour walk, and which even at 10-hour days would be a journey of over 2 weeks long. Settlement pattern data also suggests the migrants probably visited the Middle Gila River after the end of the Classic period. Because the Phoenix Basin was one of the last areas in the Southwest that was settled by Euro-Americans, throughout most of the historic period, the Middle Gila River served as a refuge for people who were fleeing conflict with and other problems elsewhere, especially oppression by the Spanish. Both archaeological and ethnohistorical data show that the Akmel-Atum allowed outsiders to resettle along the Middle Gila. It was consistently on the margins of their villages. This was done for defensive purposes and also to keep outside communities separate. The Peeposh, for example, relocated from downstream areas to the Middle Gila in the early 1800s. These people speak a different language, and their community remains largely separated to this day as Political District 7 of the GRIC. In fact, the boundary of District 7 was recently redefined in order to exclude an Octon community that was on the margin of the district. Similarly, when a portion of the Sabaipri located from the San Pedro River to the Middle Gila in the 1700s, they settled in both upstream and downstream locations from the Akmel-Atum villages. Now I'll show you a figure that shows those data in a minute here. When Kino, the first Euro-American to visit the Middle Gila River Valley, arrived in 1694, he reported Akmel-Atum villages in the Blackwater area and extending to the west. Subsequently, in a 1697 diary entry, the Spanish explorer Manji, who accompanied Kino on a later visit, reported a rancheria of 130 souls named Tuscan on the south bank of the Gila River, about 4 kilometers west of Casa Grande, and that's where Blackwater is located. However, both archaeological and historical data show that during the early 1700s, the Akmel-Atum settlement area along the Middle Gila River contracted by at least half. During this period, the Atum settlements became the target of more frequent raiding by mobile foragers, and to defend against these constant attacks, the Akmel-Atum concentrated their settlements between Pima and Gila Buttes on the south side of the river. GR 1425 is on the immediate margin of the Blackwater area, which suggests the Eastern Pueblo migrants settled in the area before the mid-1700s, when it was still occupied. And this is showing historic period projectile point data, which are very highly concentrated between Gila and Pima Buttes here. And as you move away from that area, you can see the density of the historic points drop off. The fact that the Akmel-Atum only allowed outsiders to settle on the margins of their community further supports the observation that the migrants arrived after the Classic period, when Casa Grande, which is immediately south, was no longer occupied. Because the Atum relocated further west in the mid-1700s, it's most likely the migrants arrived after around 1500 and before 1750. However, the radiocarbon dates suggest the most likely arrived after roughly AD 1680 and before 1750. It is possible to further refine more precisely when the migrants may have arrived by considering settlements patterns in the Rio Grande region. And this shows the density of subiprary points, which are associated with people from the San Pedro area. And you can see in contrast to the local point types, the densities of these subiprary type points are actually higher outside the core area of Akmel-Atsum occupation along the Middle Gila River. Fray Marcos de Niza led the Spanish entrada into the American Southwest in 1539, and he was then followed by the Coronado expedition a year later. Subsequent 16th century Spanish expeditions in 1581 and 1582 set the stage for colonization of the Southwest. The first Spanish settlement in New Mexico was established on July 11th of 1598. This settlement was in northern New Mexico, about 40 kilometers north of Santa Fe. However, the location proved to be vulnerable to Apache attacks, and the settlement was moved to Santa Fe in 1610. Almost immediately after their arrival, conflict arose between the Spanish and the Acoma, which resulted in the deaths of hundreds of Acoma men, women, and children. Also in 1598, the territory was declared a missionary province of the Franciscan order, and friars were appointed to individual pueblos where they established missions, at least 4 in the middle Rio Grande region and 3 in the Rio Abato area to the south. During this time, in support of their colonization and missionary efforts, Spanish authorities extracted tribute in the form of agricultural products. They also instituted a system of conscription to provide labor for Spanish haciendas and farms. These factors, along with the introduction of European diseases, as well as increased raiding by Athabascans, all combined to decimate the native Puebloan population. Spanish priests also curtailed Puebloan religious practices, which further antagonized them. This situation culminated in the Pueblo Revolt of AD 1680, which drove the Spanish from the Rio Grande Valley. As a result of the conflict, by the spring of 1682, all the communities of the Rio Abato district had been abandoned, and all of the Tiawa villages were destroyed at this time. Substantial evidence indicates that the various populations within the district were divided, and they dispersed in planned migrations to a variety of different areas, including the Hopi Mesas. After conflict with the Spanish had subsided, all 3 Tiawa settlements were subsequently reestablished by segments of their former populations in the or early 1700s, which corresponds with the temporary nature of the stay at Gila 1425. To summarize, the exceptionally long distance migrants traveled suggests they were attempting to escape Spanish colonists rather than Athabascan raiding, which was also occurring on the Middle Gila. The period between AD 1625 and AD 1680 had the highest population loss within the Rio Abato area, and this coincides with the period when Gila 1425 was on the eastern margin of the Middle Gila River settlement area. Consequently, in aggregate, the archaeological and ethnohistorical data show that a group of migrants from the Central Rio Grande and/or Rio Abato districts temporarily relocated to the Middle Gila around AD 1680 at the time of the Pueblo Revolt. In conclusion, archaeological data, in conjunction with ethnohistorical information, show that a group of migrants from the Eastern Pueblo region along the Rio Grande River visited the Middle Gila after the Classic period, probably around AD 1680. These archaeological data help bridge the perceived gap between prehistory and history, a time which is still commonly referred to as the Protohistoric along the Middle Gila. This period saw the expansion of Athabascans and other mobile people who displaced sedentary farmers such as the Atum from much of their former territory. As a result of the increased interactions of disparate populations brought together by the population movements that occurred at this time, substantial changes in regional cultural traditions occurred after the Pueblo Revolt in AD 1680. The appearance of Tohono O'odham, that is Papago, green glaze wares in the historic period is one possible example of this process. And it is further evidence that some Eastern Puebloans may have closely interacted with the O'odham. Thank you, and I believe we have some time for questions.
Thank you, Chris. That was wonderful. We'll give folks a few minutes to see if we have questions. Sometimes it takes a little bit to get them up. That was very interesting and nice to have that focus on the later time periods that we haven't really done many lectures in that period recently. So we appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. Within the Phoenix Basin, it's highly concentrated in that one small area, and that's part of why, you know, if you're not on the reservation, you don't see it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Let's see. No questions at this point, but we'll give it a little bit of time.
I must have answered everything.
Yeah, it was totally clear.
So far out of left field, no one knows what to ask.
You were talking a little bit about the green glazeware. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more and how that connects to what the ceramics that you've been talking about?
You know, to be honest, I'm not a ceramicist. I mean, I'm sure you could tell that from my presentation. I specialize in lithic analysis, and you know, there hasn't been a whole lot of work done on the green glazewares. We've done some XRF analysis, and there's been some work done elsewhere on the nature of the glaze. You know, what I do know is that it shows up sometime in the historic period. I think exactly when is not well known. And it's, again, perhaps not coincidental that we have this evidence for people coming from an area where glazewares were made, and then the O'odham beginning to produce similar ceramics themselves. And that's part of that whole coalescent communities process, where, you know, people coming together after the time in the Pueblo Revolt resulted in dramatic changes to ceramic traditions across the Southwest, not just in the Eastern and Pueblo, Western Pueblo regions. You also see major changes in the Phoenix Basin. And, you know, Salado polychromes are well known to have gone away. And, you know, people are less familiar, again, because all that information is concentrated within the community about the historic period buffwares that were produced and used in the Phoenix Basin. And, you know, a lot of people aren't aware that, you know, historic period black on reds were common, and polished red wares were common in the historic period. And you'll see people, you know, saying that, you know, thinking those date to the classic period, but polished red wares were common in the historic period up until the early 1900s.
Great. All right, we have some questions coming in. Sure. Let's see. Why do you think the migration area was so limited to the one small area?
You know, it's hard to say how big a group of people, or how, you know, it's actually a fairly large area, and you can have a fair number of people camping there. And the nature of the features that they built were just really difficult to identify, because what they did was they took the existing canal channel with the berms, and it looks like they just put sort of a roof over the top of it, a sort of a ramada, and then used the two sides of the berms for the walls, essentially, of the structure. And so I suspect very strongly that we missed the vast majority of those features. And the site area is actually fairly large. And again, it would be nothing but a pure guess at how many people were there. But I wouldn't think that it was a very large group. I mean, it must have been more than a few dozen, but it certainly wasn't in the hundreds, and definitely not in the thousands.
Okay. Here's another one. Let's see. Did you say that non-local ceramics at Blackwater consisted of 0.4% of the assemblage?
Yes, that's correct. They're a very small percentage, and that's generally the case for our collections. We don't have a lot of intrusive ceramics, and in fact, on the Middle Gila, we have fewer intrusives than they get on the lower salt just to the north of us in the Phoenix Basin. So they're very uncommon in general. And we had a number of other, we found a shirt of 4 mile polychrome at GR 1425, and nobody on the crew knew what it was, just as no one knew what the glaze were when we found them, because we don't find these things. And in fact, it took us quite a bit of asking around with different ceramic experts before we could find somebody who knew what they were, because they're just not found in this part of Arizona.
Right. Are there cultural stories among the Eastern Pueblos for migration into the Phoenix Basin?
That's a very good question. I do not know the answer. I am not aware of any autumn stories regarding the arrival of migrants.
Okay. Please discuss the context in which these artifacts were found and whether they're believed to be in situ or redeposited.
Essentially, almost all of the artifacts I talked about were collected from the modern ground surface, which we find is generally the case with historic period artifacts because they're recent. There hasn't been time for them to be buried. So the vast majority of them were on the ground surface. Their clustering in different areas suggests to me that they were all in situ.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This one is from Jerry Holmes. He says, Room Raider wants to know what the head is behind the presenter on the low display table.
I was worried about that one. It's a mask from Africa. Actually, South Africa was fortunate enough to get to see rock art there with David Lewis Williams, and that's one of my souvenirs from the trip.
Great, thanks. All right. Which tribes were consultants in the Rio Grande?
Consultants?
That's what it says.
We haven't done that, and it's something that we probably should follow up on. I mean, this was done for a data recovery project that we're way over budget on. Mm-hmm. It was, a relatively small site and a relatively small project for us. And again, we were actually fairly disappointed initially with what we found in the field, and it wasn't really until after the fact, when we put all the analyses together, that we realized exactly what we knew, exactly what we had. And so that's part of why this presentation has evolved, because as we put the different pieces of the puzzle together, the picture became clearer and clearer. And at first we weren't even sure if there was, if this stuff dated to after the classic period or not. And one of the things that certainly we should try to follow up on is doing consultation with some of the Eastern Pueblo groups to see if they have any cultural knowledge of this migration.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
It certainly wasn't documented in the Spanish accounts. There's no indication of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see what else we have here. This is from Gary Huckleberry. Nice talk, Chris. Did Grick take any OSL samples from GR 1425 to get some independent chronometric data on the features associated with the Rio Grande glazewares or luminescence ages on the pottery itself?
We did not attempt luminescence ages of the pottery. We did get one OSL sample from one of the canals, but it was a pre-classic feature. I think it dated to, I can't remember the exact date, but it was around 1150. All of the canal deposits appear to have, well, not all, but most of the canal deposits appear to have predated the time, again, when these people visited. And again, they were mostly staying in derelict canal channels, so they didn't have water in them. Mm-hmm. And we didn't, in part because the stuff was on the surface, we didn't have a lot of options for chronometric materials. And because the features weren't very well preserved for the most part, we only got potential radiocarbon candidates from that one feature 44.
Thanks. Has there been similar glazewares within other sites east of the Gila River Reservation where you work?
The only ones I'm aware of, and I should credit Susan Eckhart for doing the analysis of them for us. She is only aware, and she's one of the experts, so she knows far more than me, of a handful of sherds that have been found on the San Pedro River. And otherwise, I do not believe they've been found within Arizona before.
All right, and here's a follow-up question. Where did the immigrants go after this? Did they return to their homeland after 1692?
That's what the settlement pattern data would suggest. You know, all of those villages were abandoned at around 1680 at the time of the Pueblo Revolt, but the Spanish were able to talk most of the people into returning, and all of those villages were reestablished. So I would suggest, yes, that the people left and returned back to the areas that they had come from.
Great. Do you think they were manufacturing projectile points to return to the Rio Grande area to attack the Spanish, or for defense in the Middle Gila as they were migrants?
I would suggest more of the latter, that they were producing them for their own defense. And the point types we have are also designs that are intended for warfare, for use against other people. And so I would suggest, and at the time, Athabascans were raiding the Middle Gila communities as part of what was forcing them to aggregate. And this process had already been going on. They'd already largely relocated from the north side to the south side of the river. So these people would have been, you know, in the danger zone on the edge of the communities, which again was a convenient buffer for the autumn on the Middle Gila, but it placed the immigrants at greater risk, being on the fringes of the Ottoman communities, just as was the case for the Peeposh.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. You mentioned there was a difference between arrow points used for hunting animals and hunting humans. Can you talk about that difference?
The primary distinction is that arrow points that were designed for warfare were designed to detach within wounds. There's a couple different ways the designs differ, but that's one of the main ones. Arrow points designed for people were designed to detach within wounds, because people are extremely adept at removing arrow shafts, much more adept than deer or other animals. And if you pull out the shaft and the point stays behind, it creates a much more dangerous wound. Whereas in contrast, points that were designed for hunting large animals were designed to stay securely attached onto arrow shafts, so that after the arrow entered and the animal continued to run, the arrow tip would cause cutting and increase the damage. There's some other differences in material type and other things, but that's the primary distinction. I did a 2015 antiquity article on that subject if anybody's interested.
Great, thanks. How did the points compare stylistically with points from the Rio Grande?
That's another good question. And I'm not aware of major differences, but you have, you know, essentially all across the Southwest, well, actually much of North America in late prehistory and then into the historic period, you see unnotched points, and they are called different names regionally, but triangular unnotched points don't have a lot of differentiation in terms of style or other characteristics, because they're just unnotched triangular projectile points. And actually similar points to that were produced over a very long period of time. And one of the things that I've argued is that the primary way to separate them is based on size, because in general, not just between atlatl dart and arrow points, but within arrow points, they generally became smaller over time. So that the teeny tiny points you see that people call bird points, which weigh about 0.3 grams and are about the size of your fingernail, were the points that were used by the O'odham in the late historic period. And at Sakati, which is an important site because it doesn't have much of any prehistoric habitation at it, the projectile points from that site there's 100 of them that we collected from the surface, and all of them are unnotched. There's not a single notch point. There's not a single stem point. All of the points are unnotched, and they're all very small, and most of them tiny. So we have, you know, and you see a similar pattern elsewhere. And again, I would argue that those unnotched points were designed to detach after they entered and create a more serious wound.
Mm-hmm. Chris, you mentioned the article that in Antiquity, I think you said, is that one that you gave us as a for future reading?
I don't think so. No, I didn't.
We could maybe take that reference and put it in the follow-up letter if you want to send that to me.
Sure.
That
Yeah,
would
I'd
be
be happy
great.
to.
Folks might be interested.
Yeah,
All
I
right.
have
Oh, go
a
ahead.
lot of points, articles on each of these. There's a key article on the Sabipri points and the historic point distribution, which I think I put in the, I can't remember, to be
Yeah,
honest. I couldn't have recommended reading, but
okay.
I'll send you that and other relevant ones.
Okay. This is a general question. When a site is found before construction starts, do the companies give you time to investigate the artifacts?
Yes, and that's exactly what we were doing here. Even though this is not a federal undertaking, which requires compliance with the Section 106 process, the tribe, perhaps not surprisingly, is very good about making sure that undertakings don't impact significant archaeological sites. And because most of the project area was in the modern river, most of the project area for the sand and gravel plant is located in the modern riverbed, there was very little there. And it was just this one relatively small site that it consisted predominantly of a series of canals, and they were very supportive and have supported our research throughout.
Great, thanks. I think I have one last question. Did you find any burials, and if so, what type?
Nope, no burials. That's one of the things, one of the other lines of evidence that it didn't have permanent habitation, because almost invariably, or essentially invariably, with pre-classic and classic period sites along the Middle Gila, you always have burials in and around habitation areas. And we did find some isolated human remains, but there were no formal interments anywhere in the site. And again, you could see from that earlier map that showed the subsurface testing that we did. We tested it from one end to the other, and also I didn't mention metal detector transects at the site as well, because we had a little bit of historic stuff, but that all turned out to be, well, not all, but mostly turned out to be from the early 1900s.
Here's one more. What % of your study accounts for trade activity?
I'm not sure how to answer that. Obviously the vast majority of the activities over the course of the many centuries the O'odham have lived in and around this are unrelated to this, event that I talked about here tonight. So it's a tiny fraction of the overall, sort of occupation and use of the site. There is, percentage of trade materials vary dramatically based on material type. Obsidian, for example, none of it was locally available. And so 100% of it had to be brought into the Phoenix Basin. And that's part of why it's so important. And there's been debates about different sorts of ways in which obsidian could have been transported. And it certainly came in different ways. But in my opinion, and I can give you a reference to an article on this, I think the data strongly suggest, for example, you don't see fall offs with distance in a neat way, which you would expect if you were just walking to the source. The closest sources should be most common, but that's not the case. And some of the closest sources, such as sand tanks, almost never show up in the Phoenix Basin assemblages. But the sand tanks obsidian is located in the territory of the Hatchet O'odham, who are antagonistic with other O'odham groups. And there are other types that are much more common than you would expect based on their distance and a series of other things. And that's part of why I've argued that obsidian was predominantly acquired through trade and as whole nodules. And that's another thing. If I were going to source, there's no way in the world I wouldn't take 2 seconds and do some initial flaking, because so much of that nodule is lost when you try to flake it. And you'd save a ton of weight if you just spent 2 minutes flaking it. But if the value of that material was based on the quantity there, then there's incentive for you to bring as much of it as you possibly can.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, I think that's all we have for tonight. Thank you so much. That was a very interesting presentation. We really appreciate your time tonight, and hope you have a good evening. And thank you everyone for being with us. We'll see you again in November for the Traditional Technologies lecture. And everyone have a good evening. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you both.